speed typing abilities.
I can type fast. I had typing in high school.
Yeah.
A skill I
Um,
have not lost.
it's a something or other.
It comes
Um,
in handy for the writing of manuscripts.
it does. It's an important skill. Um, before we do that, we're going to have a little question.
All right.
Little
Q&A
simple
with
question.
Phil.
Yeah, little question. Um, the worst sermon you've ever preached or invitation? It's slightly irrelevant.
Okay, so this is confession time. Is that what this is?
Do with it as you will.
There was a time when I was young. This is like 20 years ago, by the way. In my youthful ignorance, I had not prepared well that week. And let's be honest, it probably meant that Madden came out or something, right? Because I'm youthful ignorance. Maybe youthful stupidity is better
Yeah.
description. And I committed what is like the cardinal sin, which was I printed off an executable outline
Mm.
and preached an executable outline on Philemon. Um, and here's the good thing: a couple of friends called me out on that. They knew something was different. It wasn't the typical quality in work, and so that was the first and last time to just steal an outline and not do any work. So that's it, and I'll never forget that to this day. So there you go.
Yeah, that's a learning moment right there. Well, I've
Yeah.
long said that for me, the worst one was the first one, and that was an invitation presented on a Wednesday evening, dealing with the armor of God, and it was
Oh
my
yeah,
own
you talked.
work.
You and Walls talked about that.
It was my own work, and it was bad. Like I can't even, I can't even
Look,
say.
I'm not saying. Look, I will say this. I'm not saying that there weren't worst outlines. Obviously, executable outlines has got to be somewhat decent.
Yeah.
But that was the worst sermon. I'm not saying that there weren't worse messages. It was certainly the worst presentation in 24. So, yeah. Anyway, there you
um,
go.
you know, here's the other little two steps of that. Mark Copeland is a friend of mine. He used to visit out at Wilsonville from time to time when I was preaching out in Oregon, where his brother was a member. We'd sit down for a meal whenever he'd visit, and I attempted for a while to make my lessons into that structure and format, and watch my
Can't do it.
lessons get worse and worse because he's really good at being Mark,
Yeah.
and I'm clearly not good at being Mark. Let's just uh, let
You're
it
no Mark
all be.
Copeland.
Let's just all let it all be there. Uh,
Neither one of us are a Mark Copeland. That's what we're saying here.
yeah, yeah, which is fine. I love
Yeah,
Mark.
that's
Love the
fine.
work that he does. I think it really helps a lot of Christians, particularly brethren overseas. I know personally have really been strengthened by his breakdown of the text, and it's helpful.
Yeah, it's a great
But
commentary.
yeah,
How about that?
a pointer in the right direction is kind of the way that I think about it. It points you in a good, strong direction of where do I start, where do I go from here, etc. But Terry and I wanted to talk about something we've been bouncing over the conversation streams a couple different ways, some terms. And I think sometimes because we don't define our terms, um, we don't understand each other. It's a universal challenge. And so for our specific little niche right here, um, we're going to talk
By the way,
about
by the way, Charlene Rice says you learn from your mistakes. Look how far you've come in your work. I would just say that's debatable.
debatable. Yeah. Charlene, we really
We
appreciate the kind
appreciate your
comment.
optimism, but the reality and honesty is somewhere far less of your optimistic statement there.
Yeah. So sometimes we'll use phrases like an outline, like here's my outline, and we are very loose with what that means.
Yeah,
Sometimes Terry and I will both use the phrase a bulleted manuscript,
yeah,
and that's maybe not as clear to some folks as it could be. But if we say manuscript, almost everybody assumes that means that every single word you're just reading what you've written. I think, and I say that if you've got a different set of terms that you've used over the years, drop them in the chat. I'd love to see those. Over the years, I have really tried to be hyper aware of new ways to think through my process when it comes to going from I need to speak about this to this is what I've said about that. Um, and so what I want to do today is talk about that, talk about these terms of an outline. What do we mean by that? What's its use and tool for you, for others? Talk a little bit about shifting from that to the bulleted manuscript, which is kind of what I end up in. But sometimes there are sections of it that are literally manuscript, or there are some messages because of the audience or the timing or the need to be really careful with how I phrase things, then I would probably end up being in the this is a manuscript now kind of
Yeah.
thing. So Terry, what about you? Like terminology wise, let's get some bounce back. I've got actually my Logos pulled up to show and kind of work through a process. So we're going to do a screen share here in a little bit to um, um, show some of this.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't know if you gave me screen sharing ability, but I could throw something up there too. So I think one of the things that's really interesting in all of this is maybe the evolution of the process for me personally. And I will tell you what's interesting is for me, COVID really has impacted the way I do this, and that seems to be odd. Here's why. We currently are doing a kind of a hybrid thing where we meet outside and inside at the same time. Those inside are watching those of us outside on the screen. And I'm sure at some point we'll transition more to inside, but that's where we're at right now. Because of that, and because of using different microphones and trying to avoid any possible cross contamination, we have I have avoided using the lectern altogether. But my buddy Edwin Crozier can memorize his whole sermon, and he can give you the outline, and you could read it, and he's going to be 95% accurate. I'm not there yet. So what it's done for me is I've had to change more to a bulleted kind of manuscript than I was before, with some more shorthand. Whereas before, what I had was really what I would call a completely outlined manuscript, word for word outlined manuscript, and sometimes I do from an iPad. Then I don't from right now. It's on actual paper stuck in my Bible, half sheets of paper. Sometimes that would be on an iPad size screen, like somewhere between 8 to 10 pages long. And now I'm on 4 half sheets. Cut that in half. But there are times I spoke at a memorial service on Sunday, and that was more back to the original because, like you said, there are times where you want to make sure you don't allow for any kind of wiggle room. You want to make sure. I'm a person, and you and I have talked about this as well. We talked about this on Do the Work. I'm a person who really believes in trying to specifically craft and gear your message to kind of this combination of all your audience members, and you want to try to hit everybody in some place. And what that takes is I treat my sermons more like a speech. This has come up in some other conversations, and let me say this: all these speeches you see these politicians giving right now are the product of not just that politician, but an entire staff of strategists and speech writers. That it's a team that comes together. There's a lot of work. There are people that get paid to do nothing but write speeches. And so from that standpoint, because of that, I try to approach that the same way. Because of my memory limitations, that means that I need to have the majority of that kind of in one place.
Right. And my whole preparation journey has gone from very simplistic outlines to incredibly detailed outlines to only using PowerPoint charts and the bullet points, very similar to maybe where Edwin is at, where the whole message was done with a level of extemporaneous and pre-planned ideas, to nearly manuscript for the most part right now. And I do all of it off of an iPad outside. It's all done that way with the Bible next to the iPad, and I'll sometimes pick up my Bible itself to read key passages from or quote from at times. So that's kind of the model I'm using. But I wanted to talk about this in a process point too, because it's not just identifying these terms. We've talked about Logos before. We've showed some of those tools before. And Terry, I think you should have screen share ability as well. But I was going to show mine first here.
Yeah. Because you're the Logos guy and I'm not, so mine will look completely different.
So here's a little Logos layout for a text that we've been studying in earlier stuff. And, there's things where you can fix typos, and clearly that's a typo. This should be 2 Corinthians 10 through 13, not 1 Corinthians 10 through 13.
The typo.
But here we go. So this is an outline at this point. This is what I would consider the beginning of a skeleton outline if I was going to do a quick summary of the last few chapters of 2 Corinthians. And so I would break it out, and here's my things, if you will, that would be the things I would be talking about. The warrior, the father, the fool, the apostle. Those would be like the 4 points of the idea. And then I would start figuring out what I was going to do with that. But this is an outline. To me, this is where an outline begins. It begins with this crafted idea. I've got 4 key ideas. Eventually, I would come up with an introduction, draw it in. Maybe it's a story, maybe it's a scripture, maybe it's an interaction of those 2 things. I've got another little outline below there that I'll show in a little bit. And then there's going to be a closer that's going to come to that. And so with each of these steps, we move forward. And so that's the process. If I say outline, it starts or looks like this. And I'll start pulling in the principles that I want to emphasize to build down to it. Now, for me, that might also include opening up a notebook of notes over here. And so I'll close off this Romans notebook, open up a new one, and get in here. And since we're going to be in 2 Corinthians, open that guy up, scroll down, and we immediately hop into chapter 10. And so now I've got my detailed notes on the text that I can pull from in preparation now to decide what I want to bring. Generally for me, that means synthesizing some of these ideas or updating them with whatever I've read recently to try to highlight a lot of this. And so I've got it all broken down, incrementally here with synopsises of the chapters. So here's a synopsis of chapter 11, that lays out a lot of these ideas. And I'll go back in here and I'll just basically insert those into each of these steps. That then produces my detailed outline. So that's step 2. From there, I will take those detailed outlines and basically create paragraphs or word blocks that will surround the scriptural references I'm going to use. So if I'm going to read from a part of 2 Corinthians 10, then I'm going to have that connected to it in some way, and maybe answer these questions. If Paul presents himself as the warrior, where's the fight? If he presents himself as the father, what kind of father? If he's presenting himself as the fool, is he wise? If he's presenting himself as the apostle, okay, who is he an ambassador for? And I'll continue to work those things until I get to the core idea that matches the reason that I'm pulling this text up. Like, why am I preaching from 2 Corinthians 10 today, etc.? Is it a sign? Is there a purpose? Is there a key takeaway message that we need? So that's the process, and using a little bit of Logos to get people there. By the way, questions, comments, drop them in the chat. If you want to make fun of me, go ahead. Terry's day off, so You can make fun of me or Shane in the chat as you desire.
Shane just gets thrown under the bus for no reason whatsoever. I think
Yeah,
that's
hey, what did I do? That's fine. Well,
yeah.
Jared's probably busy, so Shane has to take that role today. Um, is
Probably so.
that
Jared's teaching.
Yeah. So what's the balance there for you? Like, is that a similar process? Do you approach it the same way to get these steps in purpose?
Yeah, so I don't have screen share. I would show my outline, but you've turned that off for some reason.
Uh,
Don't
I
trust your
will.
partner. But so for me, yours is within Logos. There's a lot of studying and there's a lot of things that go on in the process before I ever get to the outlining process. And I'm one of those persons. A lot of times will use paper and oddly enough, like a Sharpie. A lot of times, not even a pen, just to kind of map out some things and to it looks like a big page of gobbledygook by the time it's done. But there's a process in the research process that then when I start kind of sitting down and being able to do that, what happens is that I type that out. I still don't have the ability to share, so unless
Fixed it. Fixed it.
uh, there we go. Um, so when I get up into what it used to be, when I would get up into the pulpit, is this kind of outline here. This is a sermon that probably a lot of people have heard me preach on the prodigal son. But as you see, while it's in outline format, this is 18 pages long, by the way, so this is a long one. What you see there is, though, that every word is actually represented on the page. And this is what would go into the pulpit with me. If you see something in yellow, that represents a click on the PowerPoint, so I know when to do that. Now, the biggest question I get when people see this kind of stuff is, well, how do you not lose track, or how do you not get lost in all of that? And all I can tell you is, everybody gets used to their own process, right? I mean, we all get used to what we get used to doing. And this is what I've done for 20 years. So for me, it's just not a difficulty. If you've heard me preach before, I think you would probably agree. I do not read my outline. That is not my style. And I think a lot of people, when I share my outlines, are somewhat surprised they're this detailed based on the delivery because it doesn't seem to be that way. Now, I'll admit that I've preached this lesson up here so often that I could probably do it from more of a 2-page bullet kind of outline because it's that ingrained in my memory, maybe even from memory at this point. But that's just what I've been doing. So I'll show you then what I'm doing now. Say I will if I can find that. There it is. This is more representative of what I'm doing now, which is really a shortened. One of the main differences for me is normally I will cut and paste scripture into my outline. You will see that is not done any longer. So I'm using my Bible to read when I'm outside now, and that's kind of changed things. There's also no highlighting because I'm outside. There's no PowerPoint. So all of that's different. And not every word's on there. There's a little bit more room for kind of maneuvering, although it is very small and not something that's done a whole lot. Yes, Michael Walls, I use mind maps in my research phase. That's exactly what I do. So that's what works for me. And I'll admit that a lot of that's because when I did an internship, I was required to do a word for word kind of manuscript in outline format, and that's just stuck with me. The advantages, by the way, for that are I can take a sermon and preach it anywhere, and it be relatively close to what it was the first time because it's all written down. Now, if I were to do that with what I'm using now, it would not be exactly the same. It would be close. And for me, on some sermons, that's really important because I feel like I've crafted what to me is an effective way to say something that I want to be able to repeat if I'm asked to. So anyway, that kind of roundabout way shows my process. Using the thinking maps or mind maps, and then going from there into. And by the way, once I start working on that sermon, I'll have Pages or Word up, whichever one I'm using, which now is usually Pages, and I'll have Logos up, and that process could take anywhere to 6 to 8 hours to totally get all of that done. Because when I talk about crafting a message, I mean, I'm literally, you've heard me throw out things like transitions, triads. I'm doing all of that in the process intentionally. And that just takes time. And so it is, again, and oddly enough, my Bible classes are not scripted like that. My Bible classes are far more like a very generic outline. And sometimes my Bible class is 80% memory, more than written down from my study, which I know frightens some people, but that's just what I'm used to doing. But from a sermon perspective, I want it to be crafted. Now here's where I'm at, and you and I have talked about this as well, and this is kind of part of our conversation today. One of the things that I want to do better in my preaching is to be more conversational than I am, which is a challenge. And I don't mean by that I want the sermon just to become another Bible class, but I want it to be more conversational than it is. And that sometimes is the struggle from having such a crafted speech type message to getting it into the actual conversational mode where it doesn't feel like you're preaching at somebody. And that's the challenge I think that maybe creates. Whereas maybe less material would create more conversational. I'm not sure of that, but that seems to be the thought process. Anyway, there's kind of my process for everybody.
Yeah, I want to bring in a couple of questions. BJ asked, do you alter your process at all? If so, what circumstances necessitate that? Also, since you schedule your sermons, do you ever start this process earlier than the week the sermon is scheduled? Quick answer, yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So I do engage in this process concurrently with other sermon prep, especially on the serial lessons that might
Yes.
be. I probably have already, I know this, I've already outlined the entire series for Galatians and Nehemiah, and I already had that done between October and December. Now, those are the skeletal outlines, big topics, big titles, big ideas, no sentence structure, no real details, just the big stuff. Depending on the well of ideas, sometimes I might have a topical type themed idea, and then also that gets pre-worked, generally also in that October to December timeframe before January hits and we start preaching those sermons. So the second half of your questions is a whole bunch of yeses, and it does
Yeah.
depend. Now, process. The process is continuing to mature. I guess that's the way I could think about it. Yes, I still kind of go through that same incremental outline, substantiate, and then exegete or exposit at the end of those. That's still the process. But it will depend, because not all sermons for me, though most come from the scriptures provided this expository text to work from. Sometimes they come from other ideas. Maybe it's a story that drives the narrative. And so then I'll have a different process. And I've just finished my detailed read of an Andy Stanley work on communication. And I'm trying to figure out what great ideas from that little book I can put into my process to make it better too. And so circumstances can come into play, like I learned some new stuff, so I want to incorporate that. Life is a big circumstance or pusher, because life doesn't follow my desire for a rigid schedule. And sometimes need. Sometimes I need, because the leadership team in a congregation says we need this message, and so it has to come sooner than I would have liked to do it. And I don't really like doing that. It's like not my natural thing. And so I have to fight internally on that process.
Yeah. So for me, I think it's interesting that the process is ever maturing and evolving. So I think that's one of those things that, while there seems to be I think feels like this, there seems to be this routine we've fallen into that seems to be effective. We're always second guessing that or reevaluating that, maybe is a better term. And life does change how you do all of that. I'm while I'm doing most of my work, I'm also a caretaker, and that's for to parents, and that's changed a lot of things. So those circumstances have necessitated a change in a lot of what I do. I schedule out, but I don't necessarily start the outlining process, because for Phil, that's kind of the beginning phases of his work, and I actually don't do that till the very end, an actual outline of any kind. But I will be, especially the research kind of idea and thinking. There's a lot of thinking that goes on, a lot of reading, a lot of podcast, and that will happen for a couple of weeks before we get to that point. If I know something's coming up, I'll use time that I'm in the car to be able to, especially podcast, to be able to kind of get that thing going a little bit. So by the time I sit down to, and people to ask how long it takes to write a sermon, by the time I sit down to write it, it's 6 to 8 hours, but there's countless hours before that have gone into preparing for that one moment that are even very difficult to quantify. And that's one of the values, by the way, of the schedule, is if you have a schedule kind of out for a long period of time, as you read your blogs and listen to your podcasts and those kind of things, you can know what's coming up and be thinking ahead in that process and it allows you to do better and more succinct research, I think, in the process of that. So all those, that's, a lot of yeses in there, essentially, with more explanation.
Yeah, here's a couple of quick tie-ins of the idea. Shane had asked about folks sharing both their presented message, what they spoke, what they taught, and then their outlines together, and so that you can kind of connect those pieces. I'll say that Michael and Shane, you guys should do that, because I know both of your work well enough that it's good.
Shane's outliner on a napkin, kind of like Thaxter Dickey's were.
Yeah.
So that's why Shane can't share his.
Yeah. So I'm going to also quickly share a combo in that same range. And so last Sunday, the sermon for Eastside was looking a little bit at Judas and talking about him as a cautionary tale. And in the course of that lesson, there's a segment where I talk about Mary, because it's really coming from the text of Matthew 26, verses 1 through 16 as the core of the message. And so you've got Mary, Judas, and Jesus all in that text. One of them offers worship, one of them offers waste, and Jesus then talks about his resurrection impending event there. And so you've got that whole conflict in that text playing out as a scene that Matthew is teaching us from. But in the middle of that, I graphed out some of the details about Mary. And I know Terry's already seen, I think, this little mini outline.
Well, everybody has, because you posted it on Facebook. So I don't know
Right.
why you're going into such detail, more detail than was in the outline you posted to Facebook.
Right, but I think I understand the process is the point. It's like, what does that look like, and why do you get there? How do you get to that point, that destination? So now folks could kind of see what it looks like in my outline. And so this is when I'm talking about Mary in the sermon that's preached on this prior Sunday. These are the notes that I had in front of me at that time. No changes have been made. I've actually rewritten this a little bit after preaching it to kind of make it even more precise going forward. But this is what I was looking at. This is literally what was on my screen as I'm working through this key point. And I think tying those things together is really an important series of steps. All of those then help me meet my goal, which is what BJ was talking about. Like, how does this process result in your outcome? My outcome is to teach people who want to follow God how to live like Jesus lived. And so those are like what my goals were. And here's a look at Judas that teaches us surprising truths. But Mary was the side point there.
Let me say this too, Phil, that every time I mentioned being able to reuse an outline, it is funny that every time I reuse an outline, I redo it. I never just pull it out of my files. I never pull it out of my files and just put it on my iPad or print it out and go preach it without completely retyping and redoing it, even if there's not a lot of major changes. But one of the reasons for that is that whenever I wrote that outline, even if it was 6 months ago, today there's a bigger bucket to pull from, hopefully from personal study, that deserves an opportunity to go into that same outline. And there's also the experience of when you preach on a topic for a second, third, fourth, fifth time, whatever, that you look back, kind of like you just said, you've already gone in and changed some things in your notes about Mary. Because in the process of that, you realized, here's a better way to do this, right?
Yeah.
And so part of the process is that continual improvement. And I know this, you'll be like me, that the next time you preach on Mary, when you pull these notes up, you're probably going to rethink through all that. You're just not going to print those notes or copy and paste them. You're going to go through this whole reevaluation process every time. And I say all that to say, especially to younger preachers, just don't let the preservation of your notes and the writing of your outline, don't let that be a license to be lazy.
Yeah.
And that's the potential obstacle in your work if you're not careful.
Yeah. And so we did an outline of a text. This is a textual outline to get that big picture look at 2 Corinthians 10 through 13. But it doesn't have to be an outline of text to go through basically the same process. So it could be something as simple as this little outline. So this little outline is a revision of an idea that's a classic, an absolute biblical classic.
I don't know that biblical is the classic.
Oh, it's classic and it's biblical.
I just know if I was Cornelius, that's the break I'm looking for.
That's right. That's right there. So the original has been revised using our revision theme here. But the principle talks about now a topic. This is really falls into a topical lesson and what those things will look like. And so David did some good things. David did some bad things. David did some things. That's right. And there may be some intertextual play here in the way in which Kings and Chronicles look at the life of David, and one has a hyper idealized one, and one seems to have a more raw look at his experiences, because maybe it's more about somebody else than just about David. But this is the same thing. It's the same process. It doesn't really matter in the sense of how I approach these things, because you're still going to have to work yourself through your stage. And this one can have a great storytelling entry.
But if you do it, make sure you don't talk over people's heads.
Absolutely. It's a big challenge for me. Of course, when you're 6
because you have your associate's degree, right? I think that's what the line is.
Yeah.
I've got my AA degree. I don't want to talk over your head.
That's right. I've got my
If you guys haven't heard that, we probably should drop. I think at one time there was an online link to that. We should probably drop it.
Yeah, I've got it somewhere. We'll throw it in the chat.
Yeah.
It's almost as good as the Peasel tree.
No need to mar his reputation. In fact, back in the day of cassettes, that's what you got. You got the Paul did some things, and then we had the Peasel tree on the other side. So
that's right. At that point, you knew that you will never be as good as that cassette sermon was.
Certainly not as circulated as the cassette was. That's for sure.
Most listened to lesson of its generation.
Such good memories.
If only it was on Spotify. If only if it was on Spotify.
I thought somebody put it on one of those kind of areas.
Yeah, it's shared somewhere. There's a file for it. This helps kind of clarify the process that can be used. Now, here's some things to think about also in this. Because this is the structure that I use, or you're thinking about the structure that Terry uses, that's not the only way to write through a process. But I have spoken to a lot of folks who write in other realms. I've got a great friend who is a well-known author. All of his stuff is outlined. Every single one of his now award-winning and making him tons of money stories outlined. And he outlines everything, and he researches way better than you might think.
Doesn't this go back to English class, by the way? Weren't we all taught to outline before we write? I mean, I'm just saying that was kind of how we were all raised. Things like outlining the funnel theory, having a thesis, all of these things were just common, basic sense writing when you were in school. If you're a preacher, what you're doing when you get ready to preach is you're writing. You should think about it as writing. And I think that's where sometimes the disconnect is in the process for some folks.
Let me add this caveat. I know a number of guys who are super talented with expository speech. And I say that not because they can just talk a lot, that they can talk in a precise way, they can speak in a precise way and clearly contain a message with a very minimalist outline. And maybe they're like Edwin and they can memorize stuff, or maybe they've just got a really quick mind and it works really well. I'll tell you that for me, the powerful value of moving towards a manuscript is that it keeps me from saying too much, and it keeps me from using bumper words that I don't want to use, and not just but other things that are just filler. I don't want to do that, and so I write out an outline. I
It
write out a
lessens my
manuscript.
anxiety too, by the way. I think that's the other thing is it gives me a roadmap that I'm not afraid of where we're headed next, right?
Yeah,
Or afraid of what dumb thing I'm going to say next. I think that's the other side of that. Um, and look, I mentioned Dax Dick. I think he's a great example of what you just said. I mean, that guy came in and taught class with a few notes on a 3x5 index card or maybe a napkin from lunch, and that was it because he had this tremendous bucket of knowledge, to use that term again that BJ kind of made fun of, but this tremendous bucket of knowledge. And he had an amazing memory, not just to grab from the bucket of knowledge, but amazingly sometimes to even quote sources to what he was doing from memory.
yeah,
I
by
mean,
page.
yeah, he is one of those guys that just blew me away with his ability to do that. I know I am not that. That's the whole point of this. And you've got to figure out what you are in this
Yeah.
process.
I was a student in his macro and microeconomics courses. He'd come in with two equations for the day on a piece of paper. And that was what the entirety of his notes were, to then teach us to the outline of the text. That was a
Yeah.
new revision of the text. It wasn't as if he was using the same book, it was the current revision. Page numbers, everything on point, and I just felt sad for myself. Um, uh,
Shane Scott throws in there that when you stay at the same place for a while, manuscripting helps you prevent saying the same things over and over again.
mhm.
So I think is another marvelous side point to all of this.
And which is a good impetus or pusher to make sure you review how you say things, because you may not be aware of it. And so being able to go back and look at this outline and decide, hey, maybe I'm going to use a little different approach. Maybe I'm going to try to explain things in a more relevant way. It really can help you, again, meet whatever your goals are on the table.
Yeah.
Um, and so again, whether it's any of these processes, and I'll just add one more thing. If that's your strength, go with it. If you can really do, by the way, that outline to message method, okay, great. I really appreciate that. And I'm glad that you live in the 10 talent world. Over here in my 2 talent life, knowing securely who I am,
Yeah.
um, I'm content to also do this. But I will challenge someone with this comment. If you're a regular outliner, once or twice a year, write a manuscript. Do your sermon that way. See if there's good there. Just like once, twice a year, I end up having opportunities to speak and teach where I've just got an outline of various types. There are times when the weather or the circumstances dictate that all you get is the three things in your head and you got to go. Terry, last
Yep.
comments. We're about through the cycle here. I'll read Michael's comment in a second, but you can go ahead.
Well, I think today's a valuable thing, and like we said, I think one of the things is not to put everybody in the same box. Just it's as we've repeated over and over again, you got to find your way to do things. But in the process of finding your way, would encourage you to try new ways to do things. Experiment to see if there's a better way than what you're doing. If you've never tried a manuscript, try a manuscript. If you use a manuscript, but you've never done a kind of bulleted outline, try a bulleted outline. Try to see if there are ways to improve. And the only way to do that truthfully is in this area is to try new things, which is not usually our strong point. We don't like change. This is one of those places where that may be to your benefit.
Yeah. By the way, Michael Walls is pointing out that teaching a course, the same course over and over again, gives you the experience not to need as many notes. He doesn't use the same kind of notes or any notes to talk U.S. history anymore. But all you're talking about is Lincoln and his beard anyway. So
Yeah.
the context is different. I want to say, everyone, thank you for your participation, especially those who jumped into the chat to communicate some other ideas and other perspectives. Really appreciate that. I want to again push Shane and Michael to put an outline and a link to one of their very good sermons. I've listened to each of you guys at different times, even recently. I watched Michael's sermon from last Sunday as well. As blurry as it was good to listen to you. You might want to fix that camera we talked about. Help out that a little bit that way. But I do really appreciate it. It was good stuff. With that, hope your day is blessed for each of you. If Terry and I can help you in your work, if you've got questions about what we do or God, let us know. We'd be happy to chat. You guys take care.